Hi, everyone. Welcome to our third Life Sciences webinar, assessing the impact of assumptions on clinical supply planning and their consequence on drug waste, cost, and patient risk. I'm Janice. I'm a consultant at Enside based in the US. Alrighty. Let me introduce you to our speakers today. So we have Head of Life Sciences Solutions Adoption, Marie, and Senior Consultant, Antoine, and then myself, Janice. Before we get started, we'll get started super quick, but a few things with regards to the platform. With the orange arrow, we can make it full screen or reduce the screen. And then most importantly, pertaining to questions and polls, the blue arrow is to reduce the chat or to bring it back open. The chat, while currently is a public chat, but when the webinar starts, it'll be private. And then the polls, you can answer our poll questions in there. A reminder that after the polls to come back to the chat so that you're able to answer questions. We'll ask questions. And then with regards to Enside, we've had 70% of growth in 2020. We have 2 offices, Belgium, USA. Antoine and Marie are both in Belgium. And we've had 50 plus pharma partners and 50% of the top 20 pharma companies, as well as we've done over 10,000 trials we've been able to optimize. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor away to Marie, who will talk and discuss more about today's agenda.
Thank you very much, Denise, and hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Very thankful for your participation today. So let's have a quick look to the topics we're going to be addressing together today throughout the webinar. We're going to introduce the topic, of course. Why did we choose to talk about assumptions today? And we're going to actually talk about all of the relevant assumptions that we need to perform an efficient clinical supply chain planning and forecast. We're then going to go through some of the common pitfalls that we have analyzed throughout our years of experience on optimizing clinical trial supply chain. We've seen a lot of things happen with regards to the use of the data, and we want to discuss some of those examples and case studies with you today. And then we're also going to look at typically overlooked assumptions that we think are not necessary or not specifically important to perform an efficient forecast, but are still having a very, very important impact on the whole forecast. Finally, we'll be discussing some of the benefits of having accurate forecasts. I'm pretty sure you already have some ideas of the benefits of those. Before we conclude this session and have an extensive Q&A session. So throughout the webinar today, feel free to ask your questions in the chat. We will make sure to answer all of them by the end. And if we don't have the time at the end, we'll make sure to follow up directly with you by email to make sure all your questions are answered. Now let's get into it. Before we get into the actual webinar content, we just want to ask you a first poll question that will pop up on the right side of your screen in the poll tab next to your chat. So we will be sharing the poll right now. How do you do forecasting in your organization? Do you use an Excel solution? Do you use a forecasting solution? Do you use Enside? Or do you ask your CMO, CRO to provide that service? It could also be possible that you're not working in clinical supply and therefore don't know what your organization does. So we're seeing answers flowing. It seems that currently most of the participants are using a forecasting solution other than Enside or Excel. Great. So we've got a very good distribution of participants today. And this, I think, is also a good transition to our content today. If you were attending our previous webinars, you might remember that the webinar that we've done early this year was on the topic of the most impactful drivers of waste in clinical trial supply chain. We had identified a lot of them and combined them into categories that you can see listed on the left side of this slide. Today, we're going to talk about one specific driver of waste, the planning side of things. How does the planning impact waste? How do the planning that we do, the way that we perform planning, create waste or avoids waste in the clinical supply chain? Manual demand calculations, overly conservative demands, manually calculated overages, all of that is basically linked to how we use the assumptions that are given to us to perform those forecasts and how the solutions that we're using can accurately model the reality. And the reason why we wanted to talk about this today is because we really get a lot of feedback from clients that we work with on the challenges that are created by the centralization of assumptions to perform efficient clinical supply chain forecasting. Typically, we don't know how or where to get the data, when to start forecasting. The data is not accurate or changes all the time, or we don't really know what data is relevant or not. And we typically know that in most clinical trials in the industry, we start with an expectation of having about 20% of overage, and we end up with a much, much higher waste than what we planned for at the beginning for countless reasons. I want to share a couple of statistics with you. It's not the topic of today to discuss this specifically, but I think it's a good segue to the content of today. So the average industry waste level stands between 60 and 75%. That's all clinical trials together, all indications, all therapeutic areas, all companies. This is a globally recognized average that we can see. And typically the waste that we have at the end of the trial is higher than the one that we initially estimated. At Inside, in 2021, we were able to show with our partners and clients an average waste level at the end of the trial that was 21%, again, across all indications and all therapeutic areas. And typically, the amount of waste that we had at the end of the trial was lower than what we initially estimated. And today, we're actually going to discuss some of the causes of why we can reach this when working with our clients. Because typically, the belief that we typically have is that if we have a good system and we have good data, we're automatically going to have good forecasts. And this is something that we want to put a bit at risk. It's not really true. What we believe is that if we have a good system and the right data, we also need to make sure that we use the data in the right way. And we're going to illustrate later today how one single piece of data can be used in multiple ways, and some of those ways will be much more efficient than others to bring forecast accuracy into your clinical supply chain. Because using data the wrong way is one of the most underestimated threats to forecast accuracy, which creates waste, but also risks. If your forecast is not accurate, and it's inaccurate in the sense that it underestimates the drug that you need, you're going to underproduce and end up having risk in your supply chain. So a system is typically as good as the way we use it. First, let's try to get through a couple of the assumptions that we need to perform clinical supply chain forecasting, where we can find them, and how easy they are to find. So we know that the assumptions that we need are typically recruitment projections, site opening. We need everything that comes from the protocol. How are patients randomized? What's the visit schedule, the dose levels? We need some probabilities of patients dropping out of the trial, titrating, what weight they have if we have a weight-based dispensing trial. And then supply chain information, network, lead times, drug shelf life, IRT capabilities are also very important to have. And finally, we have a couple of assumptions or data basically that could either be an output from your forecasting solution or an input. We're talking here about the configuration of the IRT system, the packaging plan, sourcing plan, the depot shipment strategy, and so on. And well, where to find that information? Most of it is pretty straightforward to find. You know that the recruitment you can find with your CRO or your clinical team. The protocol will give you information on how the treatment is conducted. The CMO will have standard lead times, networks, and costs that it can share with you. The IRT project managers will know how the IRTs work, and so can share with you their capabilities. And we tend to think that because it's a lot of information, it's actually very hard to centralize. But from our experience, most of this information is already available pretty early on, even if it's not complete. We don't know the full country list, for example. We already have some high-level recruitment projections that we can use. So typical information that is standard and easily to obtain, we're talking protocol data, CMO-related data, IRT-related data. Especially CMO and IRT-related data are things that you can centralize and reuse over clinical trials or over the multiple clinical trials that you have, because it's standard information. You don't need to reinvent the wheel all the time. The protocols will come with the data that you need. What we see is pretty typically complicated to obtain as information are all the probabilities, dropout, titrations, weight distributions, because these are treatments that are not commercialized yet. We don't know how patients are going to react to them. So we really need to make sure that we have strong assumptions here coming from the clinical team, or that at least we have robust assumptions that will allow us to have as accurate as possible a forecast as we can. Finally, there's a couple of data that ideally, your forecasting solution should give you as an output how to configure your IRT system, what's the optimal packaging sourcing plan, what overage you should need, the depot shipments. All of those are ideally optimized by the system that you're using. And now we have a second polling question.
Is it straightforward, but you don't always trust the quality? Is it complex, but in the end you manage to get the right quality? Is it really a struggle for you, or is it just not applicable? So here what we do see in the answers is that we have a mix of answers. So some people are really struggling to get relevant data. For some people, it's more straightforward. So that's a good thing, but the quality might seem to be an issue. So before we move on with a closer look to the assumptions, let's ask ourselves what's a good forecast and what makes a forecast a good forecast. So here I'm gonna use this graph that most of you probably know. It's a cumulative demand graph. So how many kits will be dispensed over the entire trial duration. And the first thing that you need to get a good forecast is accuracy on the numbers. So you need to have a model that is accurately forecasting the number of kits that will be dispensed, because here in that case we forecast that 30,000 kits will be dispensed over the entire trial duration. But if your model is simplifying some aspect, you might end up with 40,000, or on the other hand, you may also end up with 25,000, which may lead to some risky situation. The second thing that you need is accuracy on the timing, because it's one thing to get to reach the good number of 30,000 kits, but if your entire demand is shifted by 3 months or by 6 months, you might again face some risky situations. And the last thing that we want is that we don't want to do that every single day or every single week. We want to generate robust forecasts. And why do I mean by that? It's in your clinical trials, the trial never goes as planned. I mean, you will never recruit exactly as per the projection from the clinical team, nor will the dropout rate be exactly the one that was shared by the clinical team. You will always have some uncertainty. So it's important that your supply strategy can handle those uncertainties and can consider those variations from the average. So to summarize, yeah, we need accuracy on the numbers and the timing, and we need something robust. But now you may be wondering, how do I use my assumptions I have? How do I make the best out of those assumptions to find the right balance between playing it super safe and overproducing, generating more waste, or underproducing and potentially putting the patient facing some situations of drug shortage, missing some dispensing of the kit at sites? That's really something you want to avoid. And of course, you need to find the right balance between those two extremes. To do so at Insight, what we do is that we rely on Monte Carlo simulations. So it's a mathematical technique that is running hundreds and thousands of simulations quite quickly. And that generates 3 types of outputs that are tangible outputs and that you can use to compare a situation A with a situation B. Like, what would be the impact of having a dropout of 0%, considering no dropout at all, compared to a situation with a dropout of 20%. Well, the first kind of outputs from those simulations are min-max forecasts. So as you can see on the graph here, I hope it's large enough. You may forecast on average that you will dispense 4,500 kits, but you see that you also have 2 extra lines, because as we run thousands of simulations, we have enough statistical data to extract also the minimum amount of dispensed kit and the maximum. So you always get a robust forecast with those min and max values. And this goes for the patient demand, for the number of site shipments, for all the forecasts coming out of the Monte Carlo simulation. The second type of output is the average. The average is not something that the system will ask you to evaluate. You will not have to make an educated guess on whether the appropriate amount of average is 20% or 60 or 80%. No, it's an output coming from the simulation, coming from, again, the large amount of data thanks to the thousands of simulation. And it's the minimum average that is needed to safely supply all the patients. If you do not have that, you might face some risky situation. And again, those simulations allows you to assess the risk at all stages of the supply chain, at site level, but also at local depot and at the central depot level, and being able to, and you'll be able to foresee any kind of risk that could occur in the future, and of course prevent it instead of doing any kind of firefighting when it occurs. So we've been discussing about what makes a good forecast, the different types of assumptions. There are two types of assumptions that we will discuss today. The first one is the one directly impacting the patient demand, and Amaury will talk about the typical pitfall associated to those assumptions, and then I'll discuss the one that are indirectly impacting the supply demand. Amaury, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Antoine. And hopefully now everything should be okay again with my computer. So absolutely. Right now we're going to go through the assumptions that typically impact directly the patient demand, whether patients drop more or less out of the trial, the recruitment is faster, slower, whether they wait more or less. That is going to directly create a higher or lower demand in your clinical trial and in your forecast in general. And we're going to talk about right now the pitfalls in the way that we use these assumptions. These are very important assumptions. There is no doubt about that. We all use them in our forecasts. And right now we're just going to see different ways of using them and the impact that it can have on the planning. So let's start with a dropout and talk about an oncological trial. This is a very good example because typically oncological trials have a virtually unlimited number of visits that patients can go through. If the patients survive 2 years, 3 years of treatment, they could virtually continue taking the treatment and staying active in the clinical trial. So what we generally get to perform forecasting is an average number of months or a number of cycles that patients are going to be actively receiving drug for. And in this case, the assumption is 15 months. And we've seen two ways of using that assumption in oncological clinical trials, two main ways. There's, of course, a lot more than that, but we're going to focus on two ways that we've observed in the past. The first one is, in order to simplify our forecast, we're going to say all patients have 15 months of treatment. That way, we will have an accurate quantity forecast that will be accurate. We'll have the average of 15 months that will be accurately modeled. And the other way is, okay, we need to compute a dropout per visit, basically understand a bit that there will be patients that will only have 1 or 2 cycles, 1 or 2 months of treatments. Others will maybe have 20, 25 months of treatment, but the average is still 15 months. So we're going to compute a dropout per visit such that the average treatment is 15 months. The two assumptions use the exact same data. 15 months is the average. We didn't ask for any additional data from any other team in order to make the calculations that we're going to share right now. So let's look now at the comparison between the two ways of using the data and the impact that it has on the patient demand forecast. You can see the pink line that is the average of 15 months for all the patients. So basically all patients have 15 months of treatment. We don't consider that they drop before that. We don't consider that they last longer than that. It's something that we've seen on a lot of clinical trials being managed before we started working with our partners. And you can see that the impact here is pretty important. We're going to have a higher waste at the beginning because we're overestimating the demand at the beginning by using this assumption. Why? Well, because in the reality, we're going to have patients dropping at cycle 1, at cycle 2, at cycle 3, which means that in the short term, the demand is going to be lower than if we don't consider any dropout for the first 15 months of the patient's treatment. But then the opposite happens in the next steps of the clinical trial. When the recruitment is reaching an end and the first patients have reached their month 15 of treatment, we're not going to consider them anymore into the forecast. Meanwhile, in the reality, some of them will still be active. Some patients will be doing 16, 17, 20, 30 months of treatment, and we won't be considering them anymore. So there's both a higher production at the beginning that won't be consumed, and also a higher risk towards the end because we won't be considering long-term demand in clinical trials. This was one typical pitfall that we see in the use of the dropout data in clinical trial supply chain. Now, let's look at one. This is just really a tip for you guys because it's also another pitfall that we've seen very often is the confusion between the word median and average in oncological clinical trials. If someone tells you you have a median of 15 months of treatment, it means that at month 15, 50% of the patients will still be actively treated in the clinical trial. Meanwhile, the average means that over the whole clinical trial, we had on average 15 cycles for all the patients. The difference is that a median of 15 cycles in this specific example actually gives us an average of 16 cycles. And we had lots of cases where confusion between these two words was creating a risk in the supply chain because we were underproducing, we're underestimating the amount of drug that was needed because we were thinking that the median was the average. So this, just a tip, make sure to be careful in the wording when you communicate with your clinical team. Then let's look at the recruitment. Here we have a clinical trial with the first patient in January 22, last patient in July 24. So that's 2.5 years of recruitment, 800 patients, 25 countries, and we don't yet have a final country list. We've also seen two ways of considering this in supply forecasting. The first one is, let's say we have a linear recruitment, 10 patients per month or 20 patients per month for the whole trial duration. And the other one is considering that even though we don't have a country list, we know that it might take about 6 to 8 months for all the countries and all the sites to be brought into the clinical trial and to be actively recruiting, meaning that there is a slower recruitment at the beginning. And once again, this is a case study from a client that we worked with on a clinical trial that was already ongoing when we were called in. You can see the initial forecast of the recruitment is the pink line. Meanwhile, the green line is the one that we have computed based on the consideration of the site and country opening rate. So one interesting thing here is to compare the monthly demands in this clinical trial. If you use a linear recruitment, your demand at the beginning is going to be a lot higher. Your monthly demand is going to be a lot higher than it's supposed to be. And towards the middle of the clinical trial, when you're going to recruit maybe a lot more patients per month than what you had estimated with a linear recruitment, your demand is going to be a lot higher, and you might have not planned enough manufacturing to cover it. Then we can also talk about titrations. This is one of the most complicated assumptions to consider in forecasting. In our example here, we have 3 dose levels. All patients will start on the low dose level. We have low, medium, and high, and titrations are possible at every cycle. We have 2 common pitfalls that we see here. The typical one is to consider more than 100% of the demand, and say that, for example, we're going to have 50% of the patients on each dose level, which in the end will sum up to 150% of the demand, right? So we've worked with clients that were typically saying we have 50% of the patients on each dose level, and we're adding a 20% overage on top of it. But 20% of 150% of the demand is not 20% of overage. It's a lot more than that. The second pitfall is to not consider the fact that patients can change doses at every visit over time. So just saying, okay, we're going to have 1/3 of the patients on each dose, and that's it, and let's just do our demand forecasting based on that. At least we'll get good numbers. So typically, it's the comparison between these 2 case studies. On top, you can see a titration scheme where patients are starting on the low dose level and step by step joining the medium and the high dose levels. And by the end of the trial, we have a certain percentage of patients on each of the doses that are completely different from the previous visits. Meanwhile, the second case is we just consider a stable number of patients on each of the doses for a simplified demand forecasting. And the impact on the actual demand forecast is pretty important. If we look here at the low dose level, the orange line is once again considering no evolutions, just all patients. Well, in this case, let's say 50% of the patients will be on the low dose level for the whole trial duration. It doesn't consider that at the beginning, we're going to have more patients on the low dose level. And towards the end of the trial, we're going to have less than that because they will have up titrated to medium or high. So this demand curve is going to have also a very, very important impact on your packaging plan, on your sourcing plan, on the overage and the waste you're going to have at the end of the trial, overproducing at the beginning, not consuming the drug, and potentially having some risk towards the end. Sorry, it's the opposite, actually, having risk at the beginning and potentially overproducing towards the end of the trial. You can also see here that by considering the variability of the titrations, that patients can go up and down at all times, the solution has computed here a maximum and a minimum demand which is building in the robustness that Antoine was introducing earlier. If you don't consider those titrations, that robustness will not be built into the system, and the production plan that will come out of it will not have the right amount of overage to cover this uncertainty in the right way. And the final example that we have here is on the weight-based dispensing clinical trials. Let's say we have a trial here with an average of 70 kilos we're considering for the patients. The dose is 10 milligrams per kilo, and we have 100 and 400 milligram kits. If we say that patients are on average 70 kilos, it means that on average, patients will be getting 1 kit of 400 and 3 kits of 100 in order to reach the 700 milligrams that they need for their specific dose. In reality, we know that we're going to have patients that are going to be lower than that, others are going to be higher than that, and we can compute a distribution of weights with an average of 70 kilos like we've done on the graph here. We didn't receive any other assumption than the average is 70 kilos. We just computed in a simple Excel file a bell curve or a distribution of patients across the weights in order to consider that this dispensing will be different according to each of the patient's weights. And so we're going to generate two demand curves, one for the 100 milligram, one for the 400 milligram. As you can see, the curves here, it's if we consider all patients will be on 70 kilos. Meanwhile, the curves that just appeared on the screen now are showing the variability, but also the demand forecast if we consider a distribution of weights across from, let's say, 40 kilos to 150 kilos. You can see that we have, for the demand of 100 milligrams, we had overestimated, the quantities, because let's say if patients take 3 kits of 100 milligrams at 300 milligram, 4 kits would be 400, which means it can be replaced by 400 milligram kits. So the average dispensing on the 100 milligram will not be 3 kits. It will be closer to 2.5. Meanwhile, on the 400 milligram, we can have patients that will consume 2 or 3 of those kits. So we were actually underestimating the demand. We're oversimplifying a bit here, of course, but again, it's to show an example of the fact that the data that you have, depending on the way you use it, you can have more or less accuracy in your forecasts. And now we're going to discuss the importance of assumptions that are typically overlooked: shelf life, lead times, IRT capabilities, the timing of the first shipment. And for this, I'm going to leave my colleague Antoine take the floor again.
Thanks, Amaury. So yeah, we've been discussing here some assumptions that are impacting directly the patient demand. So how many kits are being dispensed. But if you want to come up with a robust forecast, not only for the demand, but also for your supply planning, you need also to consider other types of assumptions. Here, as you can see on the screen, we see the shelf life, the lead times, but there are plenty of other assumptions like do you have booklets, do you have label groups in your trial? And those aspects are very important to consider when you come up with the supply planning, with the quantities that you will have to package and label or source. So let's start with the first one. We have a couple of case studies, but let's start with the shelf life. So obviously, as you can imagine, the shelf life will impact the supply planning because it makes a big difference if you have 6 months of shelf life or 24 months, 48 months, because it directly impacts the kit life. How much time can the kit be used? Of course, other parameters are also influencing the kit life, the do not dispense, the packaging frequency, but the shelf life is obviously a driver. And one of our partners reached out to us a few months ago because he was suspecting that with his current setup, it would face some risk in the short term. And it was only able to get 10 months of shelf life for his drug and only to package every 6 months. So what we did is that we ran some simulations considering all the current assumptions, all the recruitment projection, the dropout, and so on. And indeed, it was right. It would be facing a risk of drug shortage, of out of stock in the short term. We investigated a couple of scenarios to mitigate that risk. And one of them was to extend the shelf life by 2 months, to go from 10 to 12 months. And how would we be able to do that? By accelerating the packaging timelines. It means discussing with your partners, indeed. But in that case, if we were able to get 12 months instead of 10 months of shelf life, we would completely mitigate that risk As you can see here, the risk of out of stock is at 0. That's exactly what we want. And really the cherry on the cake was that we were also able to reduce the costs by 6 million. But really, it's great to have, but what we really wanted is to mitigate completely that risk. So depending on your trial, depending on the packaging frequency that you have, the do not dispense that you have, increasing by 1 or 2 months the shelf life of your product can really make or break a trial. The second parameter that I want to discuss today are the shipping lead times, and it's one that I really like because it's something that is really often overlooked. Because sometimes what we've seen is that some clinical trial manager, what they do is that they apply a general average, whatever the country is. So as you can see here on the right side of the screen, you have a typical distribution network with a central depot based in Europe that is supplying a local depot in Brazil. We need 75 days to reach that local depot, a local depot in Russia, and so on. And at the bottom, we have a couple of sites, a couple of countries that are directly being supplied by the central depot. And what we did is that we did an analysis of the waste per country. So not the global waste, but we did the waste generated by each country. And obviously, as you can see, the countries directly supplied by the central depot have a lower waste, while on the other hand, the countries with local depot and with longer lead time, their waste is really high. So it's very important not to consider a global waste, but to consider the countries, to consider the shipping lead time, because they can really influence the level of waste that you're going to need to safely supply the patients. Something that we also often do is that we support during the country selection phase. If you know that you're going to have a trial with 30 countries, with 20 countries out of a list of 30 countries, it's already possible before the trial starts to analyze each one of those countries, to analyze the waste in each one of those countries, and to identify the countries that are really driving the waste. And then you can go back to the clinical team, to clean up, to your partners, and discuss and see how to properly define the country list. Then we have the ART capability. So this one is also a great assumption that you need to consider, because it's often considered as something in the background, something being standard. But you know that the ART providers, they have different capabilities, different resupply algorithms that can really significantly impact the waste, the cost, but also the risk. And what do I mean by different features, different algorithms? For example, can you define settings per country instead of defining them globally, such as the long window, the resupply frequency? Can some settings be modified during the trial life cycle, or do they have to be fixed for the entire trial duration? Is it a standard feature? Is it a customization? Can you use dynamic buffer? So there are plenty of different features from one ART provider to another that can really impact the waste. And to illustrate that, we have this case study. It's a phase 3, pretty standard, honestly, nothing very complex, except that we have several visit intervals. So at the beginning of the trial, for the first 4 visits in orange, the visit interval is 4 weeks, 1 month. And then for the next 4 visits, the patients are going to the sites every 2 months, every 8 weeks. And then finally, the final visits has a visit interval of 16 weeks. And as you can see, if we were to use an IRT that considered a fixed do not count, that has to be the same during the entire trial duration, we would have to consider the worst case. And what's the worst case here is the biggest visit interval, which is here 16 weeks. While on the other hand, if you were able to use a dynamic do not count, you could at the beginning use 4 weeks, then 8, then 16 weeks. And here that means that if you have to consider a fixed do not count, you are basically losing 3 months of shelf life. The difference between 16 weeks and 4 weeks, you're losing 3 months of shelf life. And if the shelf life of the drug is pretty short, 3 months can really have a big impact. And finally, this is something that is pretty much considered as a standard in Excel sheet and in forecasting tool, is that when you will open the site, you will directly seed the sites at their opening. So you will send the buffers as soon as they open. But the thing is that there are other solutions. It's also possible, for example, to send the kits only at the screening visit when the first patient arrives. So it might need some IRT customization, but that's also something that can be done, and it is often difficult to consider in Excel sheets or in forecasting tool. But it can have a significant impact because in some situations, for some trial, it can completely remove the need for buffers, as long as the minimum screening period is longer than the site shipping lead times, of course. And here you can see in this example, we were able to reduce the average from 65% to 49%. And for the conclusion, I will let the floor to my colleague Amaury.
Thank you very much, Antoine. And I hope that the content of the webinar was interesting for everyone. Please feel free to ask your questions, because right after this conclusion, we will be going through your questions and answering them live. So feel free to use the chat box to do so. So about the benefits of having accurate forecasts, and like we said, accurate forecast is not only about making sure that you have the right quantities planned. It's about making sure that you have the right timing, the right robustness built in to your forecast. It allows to have minimized waste. It allows to have risk management. But there's also a lot of other benefits that can come with a good forecast. First, you can have a monitoring setup because you have a good forecast. It means that you can compare your real-time data to your forecast and basically see if there's any deviations at any time to know when you have to rerun the system. This is also linked to the fact that if you have a good forecast, you don't really need to rerun your forecast very frequently because it was already pretty robust. Then there is an accuracy on the causes of waste. If you have a good feedback, you will be able to understand where waste comes from, what are the real causes of it, and be able to avoid them altogether. Instead of having some kind of hidden waste because of a wrong use of the assumptions. And finally, there is a possibility to have risk anticipation. With a good forecast, you also see risk that would typically be invisible if you didn't have a good forecast. If you forecast your supply chain, you forecast your demand, you don't see that your demand might actually be 20% or 30% higher a year from today. You don't plan for your manufacturing in time. You don't manufacture in time, and we know how long manufacturing can take. You could end up a year later having not enough drug in your supply chain to supply your patients. So it's extremely important for us and for you to make sure that the forecasts are accurate. These are only a couple of the benefits. There's a lot more, like avoiding firefighting that we can go through. And we also discussed the fact that the data that we have, the way we use it, should be enabled by a system that has the capabilities to receive any level of detail about the clinical trial. So if you have an extremely complex trial and you have very detailed assumptions, you should be able, in the system that you're using, to model all of those complexities. Basically, you can also have the willingness to use the data in the best possible way, but if the system that you're using does not allow you to do so, it's going to come to the same conclusion. You're not going to have an accurate forecast. So with the same data you're receiving today, an average number of cycles in an oncological trial, a very high level recruitment of a number of patients, and the first patient in and the last patient in date, you can reuse that data in a different way from what you're doing today to increase the accuracy of your forecast. You can also try to build robustness into the forecast according to the trial needs and the complexity that it has, because it's a guarantee for low risk and efficient monitoring. And finally, we should be able, through accurate forecasts, to also decrease waste over time instead of increasing it. It's basically a given in most of the clinical trials that the waste is going to increase because of delays, because of lower shelf lives than we initially expected, because we sent too much to a specific location. This should not be the case. We should plan efficiently in advance to avoid having a waste that is higher when the trial ends than what we had planned at the beginning. And it's a mission that we really take seriously at Inside. So our conclusion is basically that we can work as much as we want in increasing the data quality and availability. We can work with clinical teams, CROs, CMOs to get the data available. But for the forecast to be accurate, we need a solution that enables the correct use of the data, and we need the users to do the same thing. And just a quick conclusion about the different tools that we have asked you in the polls earlier. We know that Excel is a very easy to use solution. It's probably a very good solution for some types of clinical trials, but it forces you to simplify the model if your trial starts having some complexities, which means that you might be underestimating or overestimating certain quantities that you need. It's also very difficult to maintain and update when your trial is ongoing because you need to factor in real-time data, change your pages, and so on, and it can be very cumbersome and very prone to errors. We also have typically forecasting solutions. They're a lot more precise at Excel that bring a lot of values and visibility and automation and saving time. And there, it could, some forecasting solutions are really good and will allow you to very accurately model your clinical trials, but it only considers average values as an output of the solution. It will not give robustness to your forecast. It will not perform risk assessment at the depots or at the sites and show you if you have a risk of a stock out. It will ask you to enter an overage manually, and you will potentially need to update this frequently because of that. The last solution that we have are simulation-based optimization that perform variability on the assumptions with a min and a max demand, or recruitment or dropout. It performs risk assessment. It optimizes the overage for you. It gives you a monitoring application with alerts whenever we go outside of the bounds. And it means that we have a very low simulation frequency that is needed. And typically we would be around 3 to 6 months, every 3 to 6 months that we need to rerun the forecast and the optimization. So this was just a quick conclusion on the tools that are available and that can enable you to have also more accuracy in your forecasts. And now it's great. We still have 15 minutes together to answer your questions. Of course, we'll try to answer all of them because I see a lot of them were asked in the chat while we were talking. Feel free after the webinar to reach out to us if you want to have a specific follow-up on this topic, no strings attached, of course. And if we were not able to answer your question today, we'll come back to you right after to make sure that you get the answer that you deserve. So let's go. Please feel free to continue asking questions on the chat. I will invite now Janice on stage to share the questions with us, with Antoine and myself, and we'll make sure to answer the questions.
Alrighty, so let's get rolling. Question number 1. So from the crowd, how do you add robustness to the forecasts?
Okay, so it's pretty much like we were explaining a bit earlier. We're using a simulation algorithm that is going to create a virtual twin of the clinical trial and simulate multiple times the way that the clinical trial could go. So in one of the simulations, you could have patients dropping a bit less. In another simulation, you could have a faster recruitment. In another one, you could have actually a slower recruitment, which means that over and over and over, you're going to rerun the trial with multiple outcomes coming out of it. And when you put them all together, you're going to end up having a robust forecast with a minimum and a maximum demand and an average demand, of course. And so the solution that will come out of it, the production plan, the depot shipments, the overage, and so on, are going to be calculated in order to cover the maximum from the forecast that was calculated this way.
Excellent.
I hope this was clear.
And let's see next. Let's answer this one live. If, for example, the enrollment rate is not accurate enough, do you still apply the same calculations?
So yeah, if it's not accurate enough, it's very hard to know if a recruitment rate is accurate enough or not before the trial starts. So we would try to apply some learnings from past trials that we worked on. And typically, if the recruitment is 2 years long, we know that sites will typically open for 6 to 8 months. If the trial is 1 year of recruitment, we're going to try to calculate it over 3 months. But when the trial starts, it's going to be important to take the real-time information on the recruitment reevaluate the future recruitment rates based on the past data, and basically adapt the forecast whenever we see that we are really completely out of the initial forecast. That's what the monitoring is for, the monitoring we talked about. Whenever we see that the recruitment rate is going above or below the maximum or the minimum recruitment rates that was simulated by the solution, we can take action and rerun the system with that new data in mind.
Alrighty, let me see if we have any additional ones back in the chat. All right, and let's see. This is a good question. Oh, whoops. Okay, I accidentally finished answering the question early, but the question was, what can we do with cohorts?
So it's basically the same as with the recruitment. So you can take into consideration the different cohorts. You will have some variability per country. You will have some variability on the timing of the recruitment. But of course, the more information you have, the more precise your forecast is going to be. So if at the beginning you really have no idea how many cohorts you will have, how many patients you will have, it's best to keep it high level. If you already know, okay, I'm going to have 5 cohorts opening one after the other, then you can enter those kind of information in the system, and it will reduce the variability compared to a much larger high-level forecast.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Awesome. And then for our next question, can you tell us more about the alerts that show if the plan is going out of scope and if the assumptions need to be reassessed?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I'll come back to a slide with a graph to show you that. So let's say we have the graph here with the minimum and the maximum demand that was forecasted. This graph could be anything. It could be a recruitment graph. It could be a demand graph for one specific kit type or for another specific kit type. It could be the expected number of patients per dose level. It could be the expected number of patients active per visit. It can be anything, because all the pieces of information in the solution are going to be subject to simulations, and we're going to generate this minimum and maximum value for each of the assumptions, including titrations. So what we're going to do here is we're going to compare real-time data to this graph, and whenever the real-time data crosses the minimum or the maximum line, it gives an alert to the user that things are not going according to plan, and that basically the supply chain strategy that you've decided to implement, the packaging plan, the overage that you have, the depot shipments, will not be valid anymore and potentially need to be updated, and you can rerun the system, use that data for the reevaluation, and this will help you have an adapted clinical trial supply chain strategy with increased accuracy that is adapted to the new information. I hope this answered your question, Denise.
Yes, indeed. Awesome. And then I think this one's right up your alley. How do you build robustness into a single and multiple ascending dose study?
Yeah, so basically the same way as we did for the other studies. So if you have multiple dose levels, it's probably going to be a much more complex graph than the one that we have here. This one is 3 dose levels with up and down titrations. If it's only ascending and you have 28 dose levels, it's fine too. You can model that. If you have a complete uncertainty on the amount of patients you're going to have on each of the doses, we can run the simulations nonetheless, because the robustness will be built in. This graph that we showed here will be generated for each of the doses. If each dose is one different kit type, one different treatment, we're going to have a demand for each of those kit types that will be generated the exact same way, with a minimum and a maximum. In case you really want to test corner cases and extreme cases, you can also do scenario testing. You rerun the system with different values and increased values for specific doses in case you really want to build additional robustness or additional safety stocks into your production plan. But we've been working this way for a very long time now, and really even complex trials, like I said, with 28 dose levels, and I'm saying that one because it's a recent case, we were able to very accurately model it and have results when the trial was ongoing that were really matching the reality of the trial.
Awesome.
Yes. It was a great question from Greg.
Yeah. Let's see. How do you come up with weight and dropout distribution? What if I don't have a country list?
Yes. Yeah. Do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. So for the weight and the weight and dropout distribution, what we can do is that you can assume something. So of course, you can assume, for example, for the weight distribution that it's gonna follow a bell curve, a normal distribution. But then we've also observed what we've observed is that if you come up with something with a weight distribution, then you go back to the clinical team and ask them to validate that, they will most of the time come up with a more precise assumptions rather than everyone will weigh 70 kilos. So it might be a bit of back and forth, but if you want to be more precise, it's always good to have a distribution, to have something that you can not invent by yourself, but extrapolate from one single point of data. And then the second question is, what if I don't have the country list yet? That's a great one, and it's indeed often the case. You don't have the final country list yet, but if you have already a preliminary list, what you can do is assess the level of waste associated to each one of those countries. And what you can also do is you will know more or less how many countries you will have in Europe, in the US, in APAC, in South America. And based on that, based also on your experience, you know what are the typical shipping lead times that the CMO is providing. So based on that, you will be able to run the simulation, even though it's only high-level information.
Yeah, we also worked on trials where we just had the information, okay, we're going to have 5 depots in 20 countries. We just don't know which ones they're going to be yet. We can just take an assumption and randomly select a country. That's fine. For the weight distribution, in that case, I mean, there's also lots of databases on the internet that will give you the average patient's weight or the weight distribution for specific population, like, for example, cancer populations or patients with growth deficiencies. I mean, you will always find information like that somewhere. There are a lot of databases out there.
Track and report forecast accuracy over time for different inputs.
Yes, it's a great question. So we are building into our solution a possibility to do retrospective analysis. So basically coming back to data from a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago on the same clinical trial, comparing it to the data of today, which would allow to have this exact kind of KPIs. What's the forecast accuracy that you're going to have on your recruitment, on your dropout, on your titrations, on your demand, but also on your production plan and on your waste. And this is one of the big trackers of forecast accuracy for us, is more really on the amount of drug that is going to be needed in the clinical trial. If we're able to accurately quantify that at the beginning with the right timing and the right manufacturing strategy, and end up the clinical trial not having moved a lot from that and having a low amount of waste, it's a victory for us, because we know today that well, drug can be very scarce, and every drug that we save can be something that will enable more clinical trials to be launched, more patients to be recruited, recruitment to be even increased or be faster if we add more sites into a clinical trial. So this would be the way that we report currently forecast accuracy, by showing the amount of waste evolving over the trial duration. But we are building this capacity too. Absolutely.
Great. Let me double check if we have any fresh questions. Alrighty. And okay. Next, what techniques, tools, and processes do you use when working with CRO or CMO project managers to help make assumptions as accurate as they can be?
That's a great question. And it's something that applies a lot to us, because we work with a lot of companies that do full outsourcing of their clinical supply chain, which means that we are in contact directly with CMOs and CROs for both the data collection, but also the implementation of the results. In this case, I mean, the techniques are typically good practices more than anything else. We need to make sure that the certain data is collected. So we have templates for the data that we need. We share those templates with the CRO or the CMO in order for them to share the information with us. If they don't have the data in the right level of detail or the right format, that's fine too. We use our experience at Insight to typically go through that information and propose something different, something that is maybe a bit more accurate or a bit more adapted to the trial needs, and ask for validation from the CRO, CMO, and the sponsor to see if the use of that data is valid and okay for us. But it's a teamwork. I mean, it needs to be done together. It's also not something that specifically takes a lot of time. I mean, the data, like we said, is available. The only thing that we need is have the data in the right format and make sure that that format is validated by everyone and that we all agree on the way that we're going to use it.
And also just, it's important to increase the collaboration between the teams. We all know that, but it's also great to show them the impact of the assumptions that they're sharing with you. Because if they if they say, I don't know, the average number of cycles would be 10 cycles, and then in the end it ends up being 15 or 20 cycles, that's a great news for the trial itself. But from a supply point of view, that's something you want to avoid. You want to anticipate, and it's really important to show them what would be the impact of modifying these assumptions, modifying this, considering this recruitment projection. And yeah, with such a tool, you could really be doing this comparison.
Great. And I think we actually reached the end of the questions on the chat. We'll make sure, I mean, if we missed one, very sorry for that, and we'll make sure to come back to you by email. But thanks everyone for participating today. It was really great to have you here, and thanks for the interactions and the participation in the polls and the chat. Please note that if you want to have a follow-up with us, we are completely available to do so, no strings attached. We just want to make sure we have a good discussion together. You can find our email addresses on this slide. Add us on LinkedIn, of course, our pleasure. We will be writing down a handout that will be summarizing the discussions in this webinar and the questions and answers, and we'll be sharing it with everyone. So thanks again. Have a great rest of the day or a great afternoon for the people in Europe. And I hope to see you very soon for our next webinar.